So here we go, guys. I'm just going to talk about the respiratory system at this short meeting today. You have all the notes that I gave you posted. Um, that's really detailed. I'm not going to give you as detailed of notes for the digestive system for two reasons. Well, the biggest reason is I want you guys to actually do some of the work yourselves. If you look for this information yourself, you'll remember it a lot better on test day. So back to the respiratory system, the two things that I wanted to talk about that are slightly more complicated than just straightforward, what is it, what does it do, is first, the ventilation perfusion coupling. This is the physiology of respiration. And when we talk about ventilation and perfusion, that comes under three factors that physically influence external respiration. So ventilation refers to breathing in and out. Anytime you hear that word ventilation, just think breathing, moving air in and out of the lungs. The word perfusion refers to blood flow. So when we're in the lungs, the pulmonary capillaries refer to blood flow. So blood is going from one side of the capillary system to the other. As it crosses through the lungs, the blood has to pick up oxygen. We refer to the flow of blood as perfusion. Obviously, you know that in the lungs, we breathe in and out. We're breathing oxygen in. So we have to inhale, oxygen comes in. It's in the alveolar spaces of the lungs, the oxygen is, and then that oxygen has to diffuse out of the alveolar space and into the pulmonary capillaries as blood is traveling through the lungs. So it's sort of oxygen is coming in and blood comes across, and the oxygen has to bind to the blood cells before it passes through. So we refer to ventilation as this part, the breathing, oxygen coming in, the perfusion as the blood going across. And the goal is for oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin as those red blood cells pass through. So ventilation is breathing, movement of air. Perfusion is the movement of blood. The next step for ventilation perfusion is what controls ventilation, and that is levels of carbon dioxide in the blood. So what controls our breathing rate is levels of CO2 in the blood. There are sensors in the bloodstream that say CO2 is building up, and that regulates our respiration rate. The more CO2 that builds up, more that our brainstem says breathe to get rid of CO2. So CO2 controls ventilation. Oxygen levels in the bloodstream control perfusion. So CO2 levels control this part, our breathing, and then oxygen levels control this part, the blood flow. And we have sensors in our bloodstream that control blood flow. Ultimately, what happens is this. Sensors in the bloodstream that can sense the oxygen levels, they regulate arterial diameter to increase blood flow to the alveoli that are getting the most oxygen. I know that sounds complicated, I'll say it again. So oxygen sensors in the bloodstream can sense levels of oxygen in the blood and then regulate arterial diameter, that's perfusion, blood flow, and the blood flows more freely to areas of our lungs where we're getting more oxygen. What regulates ventilation, our breathing rate, is CO2 levels in the blood, and we have sensors that can sense where we increase bronchial diameter to places in the lungs where we can get rid of CO2 more readily. So just the main things to remember are this. Ventilation means breathing. It's controlled by CO2. And the sensors that monitor CO2 in the bloodstream regulate bronchial diameter so that we can expel CO2 more readily. Perfusion means blood flow, specifically in the pulmonary capillaries. and oxygen is what controls perfusion, and there are oxygen sensors that regulate arterial diameter. So those are the main three things to remember about ventilation perfusion coupling. And that is what influences, it's probably the major thing that influences external respiration in the lungs and how we get oxygen to those blood cells in the pulmonary capillary. So that was topic one. The second topic I didn't say much about in the notes because it's so complicated. I didn't want to write it all out step by step. It's all in your textbook anyway. I'll answer questions at the end of this quick talk. I'm going to draw on the board behind me, so I hope that you can see. What we were going to talk about lastly is how carbon dioxide moves in the bloodstream. Specifically what that means, it's in your book under CO2 transport or transportation. The topic is about, you know that our body cells produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct of cellular respiration. We need to get rid of that carbon dioxide. So I'm just going to move my monitor a little bit so hopefully you can see the blackboard behind me. So our cells are producing CO2. That CO2 needs to get into our bloodstream and be carried by our blood cells to our lungs so that when we exhale, we get rid of the carbon dioxide. This is the pathway that we're discussing right now. There are three ways that carbon dioxide can basically travel in the bloodstream. I did list these three on your notes that I posted. The first one is the easy way. CO2 can just be dissolved in plasma. That's fairly easy. It can travel freely by itself, just dissolved in the plasma of the blood. But not much of it does it. Only about 10% or a little less than 10% is dissolved in plasma. The second way that carbon dioxide can travel in the bloodstream is chemically bound to hemoglobin. So I'm going to do a quick review. Way long ago when we did the cardiovascular system and learned about blood, we learned that carbon dioxide, if you don't remember this, carbon dioxide can bind to hemoglobin. And where it binds to hemoglobin is on an amino acid chain of that hemoglobin molecule. Remember, oxygen binds to the iron, the heme portion. CO2 can bind to a globin chain, an amino acid. So technically, hemoglobin can bind both oxygen and carbon dioxide at the same time, but it usually really doesn't do that. When it has oxygen bound to the iron part of it, it does not readily bind CO2. When hemoglobin releases oxygen, it does readily bind CO2 to that amino acid chain. When carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, we call that molecule now carbaminohemoglobin. I'm going to draw this. This is super simple. I'm going to draw this behind me. When we have CO2 and it combines with hemoglobin, that's just HB. This is a reversible reaction, so I'm going to draw arrows going in both directions, and we get HbCO2. And we call this molecule over here carbaminohemoglobin. So we just got CO2 binds with hemoglobin, we get carbaminohemoglobin, and there's a double arrow because this can also dissociate. The hemoglobin can let go of the CO2 that it's bound to. Now, three things about this molecule. About 20%, or it can be less or greater depending on the conditions of the body, but about 20% of CO2 can travel through the bloodstream bound with hemoglobin, like this. And there's 3 points to remember about this. First, carbon dioxide will readily dissociate from hemoglobin in the lungs when it gets back to the lungs because the pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is less than the pressure of CO2 in the blood. I'll say that again. So CO2 traveling like this molecule right here, traveling in the blood, when it gets to the lungs, CO2 can readily dissociate from this hemoglobin molecule because the pressure of CO2 in the pulmonary capillaries is greater than in the pressure of the lungs. So it moves from the blood to the lung spaces, and then we exhale and get rid of it. Also, second thing to remember about this equation and this form of transportation is carbon dioxide will readily bind to hemoglobin in the tissues, in the systemic capillaries, because the pressure of CO2 at that place in the body is higher than in the blood. So the picture, we're out here at the beginning of this equation. If we're in the tissues and we have CO2 coming from the cells, and we've got now empty hemoglobin because it's already given off its oxygen, but we're still in the systemic capillaries. So we've got CO2 being released from cells, hemoglobin in the blood that's released its oxygen. This will readily bind, the CO2 will readily bind to hemoglobin because the pressure of CO2 in the tissues is greater than in the blood. So pressure pushes CO2 into the blood. Third thing to remember about carbaminohemoglobin is that deoxygenated hemoglobin has no oxygen on it, will readily pick up that CO2 to its globin chain. This is all in your textbook, but those are three major points of why this equation occurs. So at the tissue level, we get CO2 combining with hemoglobin to form this. Then at the lung level, we have this, and this dissociates to get rid of the CO2 as we exhale. All right, last topic about how CO2 is transported in the bloodstream is the most complicated. So I'm going to erase this. And the third way that CO2 can travel in the bloodstream is as a bicarbonate ion. This is a little complicated, so I'll try to go slowly. I'm going to draw an entire red blood cell. So this entire oval that I'm drawing is a red blood cell. Then I'm going to draw CO2 out here outside of the red blood cell. This carbon dioxide is coming from a cell or from cells in the body. What happens is this CO2 will diffuse across this cellular membrane into the red blood cell. So I'm going to draw it here. This carbon dioxide then can combine with water. So CO2 plus H2O. And what that yields is something called carbonic acid. This is a common chemical reaction in the body. And I'm going to draw the double arrows again just because this reaction can go either way. And carbonic acid is just H2CO3. We just combine all this stuff together. And I'm going to write carbonic acid. So we've got carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. This reaction can also happen outside of the red blood cell in the blood plasma, but very little of that occurs in the plasma because inside of the red blood cell is an enzyme that speeds up this reaction. It greatly speeds it up. So we can have CO2 and water combining out here somewhere in the blood plasma, but that happens so slowly that not much of it is really carried in this form. The enzyme that it speeds up this reaction to create carbonic acid is called carbonic anhydrase. And it only occurs in the red blood cell, which is why most of this occurs in a red blood cell. I'll go over this reaction all at the end. We're almost finished. It's not that complicated. But just to reiterate, CO2 diffuses into an RBC, CO2 combines with water, and this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, speeds up this reaction to form carbonic acid. Now, carbonic acid is a weak acid, and it dissociates fairly easily, fairly readily. And when it dissociates into hydrogen ions, So I'm just drawing an H plus, and bicarbonate ions. I'm going to label this bicarbonate. This is just a hydrogen proton. Hopefully you can see that. I'm going to reiterate this. Carbon dioxide comes into the cell, combines with water. This combination forms carbonic acid. It happens quickly in the red blood cell because of this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase. Now this acid dissociates, it's a weak acid, it's not very stable, it dissociates fairly quickly, especially under kind of basic conditions or even normal pH, and it dissociates into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. Hydrogen ions create an acidic environment, and hemoglobin binds these hydrogen ions fairly readily to buffer the acidic conditions. We're not really concerned with that right now. We're concerned with what happens to this bicarbonate ion. So this is what carries, the carbon dioxide is hidden in this HCO3 negative. Remember, the goal is to get rid of CO2 out of our bodies. The cell produces CO2. It goes into a red blood cell, combines with water to form this acid. The acid breaks apart, and we get this bicarbonate ion. That's where the CO2 is. It's hidden in this HCO3. Now, this bicarbonate ion will move out of the red blood cell into the plasma. And when it moves out of the red blood cell into the blood plasma, over here, there's something called the chloride shift. We get rid of one negative ion, and in exchange for this bicarbonate ion, chloride ions move into the red blood cell to just equalize that negativity that the red blood cell is losing. And then this HCO3 bicarbonate ion in the plasma is how most of the CO2 in our bloodstream gets transported from the tissues to the lungs. I'm going to go over this one more time really quickly, and then I'll unmute everybody and you can ask me anything you want. So remember, there's three ways that CO2 travels in the blood. First, dissolved in plasma. Second, bound to hemoglobin. And third, as bicarbonate ion in the plasma. That's the complicated one. How do we get bicarbonate ion in the plasma? This is how. CO2 moves into a red blood cell, combines with water. This enzyme speeds up the reaction to form carbonic acid. The acid is weak and unstable, so it breaks apart. Carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions, which bind to hemoglobin, and bicarbonate ions. That's where the CO2 is hidden in the bicarbonate ion. This ion, bicarbonate, moves out of the cell, and at the same time, chloride ions move in. That's called the chloride shift. And there's our CO2 that gets transported in the bicarbonate ion in plasma. It goes all the way back to the lung. It travels to the lungs like this. And then when it gets to the lungs, what happens is basically this whole reaction in reverse occurs, and the CO2 is then expelled as we exhale. All right, I'm going to try to, you guys, I'm going to try to unmute you if I can. If you can unmute yourself, do it, please.